Hello and welcome to this week's video tutorial for virtualracingschool.com for the Blancpain GT3 series on iRacing.com. We visit the historic Watkins Glen Classic layout this week, which is a very high-speed circuit with very long, fast and heavily banked corners. The lap may be quite short, but the margin for error is very small, with close barriers lining the racing surface and all the corners requiring a lot of commitment to get a good lap time. Despite the BMW being a good choice here through the corners where aero dependency is very high, the Audi actually does well overall with the long straights, and therefore I've chosen to go with it for this tutorial. As ever, I've driven in default weather, which is afternoon this week, and I've used Sprint race fuel. So I'll play the lap through first before going into further analysis. So like last week, I'm on the VRS app. I've got the list of data packs, and this time I'm going to choose the Audi data pack, and we're going to scroll down and select Watkins Glen at the bottom. We're then going to click Learn Track. It's going to play the lap through. So we're going to pause it, and we're going to jump straight into Sector 2, which is the braking for turn 1 through to the exit. So in terms of a braking reference for this corner, there is actually a change of tarmac down here, and I sort of have that in my vision as a reference, but you need to brake before then. So there are also some markers on the left. There's a 200 marker. It's also just before the 200 marker. You need to be hitting the brakes. You need to be hitting the brakes fairly hard, not too hard. So with the Audi, because I'm using, I believe, medium friction pads, you only need about 60–70% before you reach threshold. And then I'm bleeding off as the downforce comes off the car, and then at the entry to the turn-in, I bleed off quite suddenly, but then I hold the brakes on for quite a while, but there's a little bit of coasting just before I do eventually apply throttle. So if we just take this back to see the point at which I turn in, it's pretty much here. So again, you're just going to have to judge it. There's not really any references to go by. If we just take it through slow motion, it's shortly after the 100 marker. Perhaps there is a reference externally that can be used. No, unfortunately not. It's going to just have to be after the 100 marker, basically. The most important thing that you do is you hook up with this apex here. The circuit kind of cambers up quite heavily in most of the corners, in fact, but especially at turn 1 and especially at the apex. So you've got to make sure that you get hooked up nicely into this camber and you hit this apex, and pretty much as soon as I've hit that apex, I'm hard on the power, and I do actually get a little bit of oversteer on this particular lap, which you'll see just there, very brief, but at the same time you do need to be opening the steering up as you're applying full throttle. So if I skip to that point there, shortly after I've hit full throttle, I'm opening the steering, so my steering is dead straight now, and that's to kind of anticipate the oversteer. There's a little bit of traction control currently engaged, which you'll hear in the lap at full speed, but allow the car to use all of this curb on the exit and even go out onto the runoff tarmac just past the curb on the exit there. The important thing though is, and that will basically allow you to carry a higher apex speed than normal, but you definitely need to be on throttle as soon as you hit the apex and pick up the throttle nice and hard. So I'm straight to 80% there. So on the exit, like I said, wide of the curb, but notice the grass begins. You need to have half the car at least inside of the grass by the time you reach that, otherwise you will get an instant penalty. So make sure that you do that, and then it's immediately into the high-speed S's where you're thinking about line is very important. It's flat out through here, but if you do get your line wrong, or you're alongside another car, you'll probably have to lift, otherwise you'll start to run offline and then you might end up in the Armco barriers. So keep the car over to the left on the approach and hook up. So we're just going to go to the next sector now and hook up again with the camber. There's also some concrete patches within the normal tarmac which provide a little bit more grip, and they also provide a reference for where to be. So again, it's super important to hook up into the camber here nice and tight, following the curb on the inside, and follow that inside line all the way up the hill until this Armco on the right ends. Now it's very important that you are at the right hand side of the circuit before you start turning in, otherwise you'll pinch this uphill left and you'll probably run out of road on the exit. Not only that, it's also critical to exit with as much speed out of turn one as possible, and to then carry as much speed through these curves as possible. So I'm keeping my steering to an absolute minimum through this section, and basically I'm very closely sort of feeling for the force feedback. So as soon as I can feel load through the wheel, I don't turn any harder than that. As soon as you turn harder than that, you'll induce some potential oversteer. So really keep your steering to the absolute minimum as you work your way through this section up towards the carousel. So again, on the exit of the S's at the top, just follow the track over to the right, and then when you pass the DRS line, just gradually take the line of least resistance over towards the carousel. Now the braking reference for the carousel is going to be just after that barrier on the left. So if we take it to sector 4, basically as soon as this barrier on the left hand side begins, you want to think about braking. So it's just as well before the extra bit of curbing on the left, pretty much just there, just before the track kind of crests into the camber. So it's a very, very long corner, very high speed, so you don't want to be braking too hard. I reach max braking there and it's about 50%, and then I'm bleeding off fairly early, but I'm holding the brakes for a long time here, and then eventually bleeding off to about 5%, which I then hold all the way around, and then I pick up the throttle very aggressively, and that's very important. If you pick up the throttle gradually, you'll induce understeer. So by hitting the throttle really hard like that, it keeps the rotation in the car, even though the rear tyres are now loaded. So if we just play this through, you'll see how I aim for quite an early apex, and then it's a very long corner, but you want to remain tight the whole way round. Use the camber in the circuit here to your advantage. It's heavily cambered, and just make sure that you can try and hold that line nice and tight. So we actually surpassed the point at which I pick up the throttle, so I'll just go back to that. So at this point I'm still sort of slowing the car down, and then at this point I've actually hooked up with the apex, which, like I said, is a very, very long apex, and then I'm kind of just breathing on the brakes, being quite gentle with the steering just to keep the car rotating nicely, and then I hit the throttle very early. So basically, as I'm aiming at this sign off in the distance, I hit the throttle really hard, but I don't pick up full throttle until I know that I'm safe to make it through the exit, which is still quite early, just about here, and then obviously allow the car to use all of the exit road. There's a little bit of extra tarmac before the grass kind of resumes its normal line, as we approach the second to last corner for the end of the lap. So again, there's some markers for this one. You want to be braking pretty much at the 300 marker, and again, another high speed corner. The circuit basically compromises entirely of high speed corners, and again, braking fairly hard but not super hard, about 55%, bleeding off gradually, and then when I reach the point where I'm turning in hard, I'm trailing off the brakes, kind of breathing on the throttle as well slightly there. You can see some overlapping of the pedals, before then just continuing to hold the brakes for a long time until the point where I hit the throttle, which is pretty much at the apex or even just before. And once again, I'm hitting the throttle really hard, almost straight to full throttle this time. So we'll just go back to the start of the sector and play that through. So sweeping in from a wide line, making sure that you hook up with this apex. You don't need to take any of this curb, but you do need to make sure that you get nice and close to it as you pick up the throttle. And there's quite a wide exit curb, but you've got to be quite careful here because the track again is quite cambered mid-corner, but on the exit it flattens out, so the car tends to go a little bit light, and you can actually see the effect that this has had. I've had to breathe out of the throttle ever so slightly just as I run out wide onto the curb here, and then bringing the car back over to the left again for the approach to the last corner. Now I'm just going to pause it at the end of this sector because you've got another reference which you can use here, which is the black barrier to your left. So pretty much as that ends, you want to be hitting the brakes for the final right-hander. Now braking quite gently for this one because we've exited a corner very recently on the track, so the car isn't going super fast, and it's also quite a fast corner. So yeah, braking moderately and bleeding off fairly soon, and turning in just before this extra piece of tarmac on the left hand side in the grass there. So this extra piece of tarmac here, you want to be turning in just before there, and again it's very important to hook up into the camber and get onto the throttle really hard. Now I didn't trail brake so much this time. In fact, at this point here I'm off the brakes entirely and I'm breathing on the throttle. Now the reason that I've done that is because the car's turned in a bit more positively than I was expecting, and I'm just breathing on the throttle just to push the front end out ever so slightly and take a little bit of load off the front tyres. So I'm just using the pedals to balance the car on the entry, and then I'm back to breathing on the brakes until I've apexed, and then as I'm apexing, hitting the throttle really hard and picking up full throttle as the car is settled and I know that I'm going to make it through the exit. So we'll just play that through one more time on board, making sure you hook up with this apex, but don't clip the curb. That's very important. These last two corners, you want to really get nice and tight to the apex, but again, avoid clipping that curb. Shifting down into third, it's worth pointing out that that just helps the acceleration on the exit. Let's just see exactly when I do shift down. It's quite early, but it's just as I'm turning in fact. I'm down in third, and then hard on the throttle, and that extra acceleration that third gear provides. I run very wide near to the wall on the exit there, which is pretty much what you need to do to fully exploit the lap time. In fact, I left a bit of a margin there compared to what you can get away with. You can actually clip the grass here without too many negative consequences, but that was quite neat and tidy. We'll just go back a little bit further. Yeah, so you can get really close to this wall, but obviously this was a little bit more conservative, but nice, neat and tidy. And so that was a 106.652. You can find all setups, replays and telemetry for your own use and analysis on virtualracingschool.com, where you can also book one-on-one tuition with top drivers from the likes of Coanda SimSport and Team Redline. Good luck for this week, and feel free to post any questions or comments below. Thanks for watching.